6 o'clock, and I'm going to call this meeting to order. Here we go. We do have a quorum. Jenkins is not going to be here tonight, and Ms. Crittenden told me she would be running it. So this 6 o'clock meeting is a public meeting.
Which agenda
We're
item?
going to discuss the budget for the 2019-20 school year.
Yeah.
Mr. Gilbert is going to walk us through. And all of us have a packet that I believe he got for us.
Yeah. C, 3C?
Targeted for the left.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Sorry, you were waiting for me. You gonna call? Okay.
We already did that.
Oh, did you? Did I miss? I'm so sorry. Sitting here working on, I'm trying to do two things at once and doing neither one of them well. So we do not have our normal navigator, so I'm going to step in and do that today as well. So I apologize for any errors and omissions, but we're going to do our best. So this is our public meeting to discuss the budget for 2019-2020 school year. Let me jump over here real quick and get it to the presentation. There we go. So what I'll try to address everyone, and I apologize for my back against anyone. I'm going to primarily focus on the screen here to my right, and if any clarification is necessary on the part of anyone, just try to get my attention and I'll do my best to clarify any of the slides that we're going through. Just want to mention that earlier in the school year, the board appointed a budget committee. That budget committee consisted of 3 board members, including Carl Jenkins, Vice President, Mr. Ben Amador is the board secretary, and Ms. Glenda Moreno, board trustee. So we met with the budget committee. So far this year, we've met 4 times, monthly, basically starting in February. You can see the dates there. And normally at this point in time, what we would be having is a combination public meeting to discuss both the budget and the tax rate. However, this year, due to some, as you're all most likely aware, due to a lot of things that had took place in terms of school funding with regard to the 86th legislative session, we will not be discussing the tax rate at this time. Nothing unusual about that. But because we're a June 30 school district, we have to go ahead and proceed with the budget adoption. And I'll talk in just a moment about how that's going to work out throughout the rest of the coming months, as well as the implications according to the budget that we have right now. So this is a school board, or tonight we will have, subsequent to this meeting, a school board meeting to adopt the budget, the original budget for school year 1920. That's a state requirement, and we have to have it completed by June 30th. There are 3 budgets that the school board is required to adopt. That's the general operating fund, the child nutrition fund, and the debt service fund. Bear in mind that there are several other funds the school district operates, but those are federal and state programs mandated by the state. All budgetary impact associated with those are not really subject to board approval. They're dictated by the oversight of that particular fund. These are the ones that the board has authority to direct and dictate and adopts each year. So let's talk about the general fund. That's the largest one. That's the one that everyone primarily is concerned with. Challenges to a June budget adoption. Well, our certified property values do not come out until the end of July. Here we are at June 18th, and we're trying to adopt a budget, and we do not know what to expect in terms of a tax levy. We have an idea. We have received our preliminary values, but preliminary values are just that. They are preliminary. They are subject to change and do typically change significantly between when we receive them in April 25th, and when they are certified, July 25th. Another challenge to being a June 30th school year is we have this year in front of us legislative decisions that are impacted by House Bill 3. And they will have not only a direct effect on the tax levy, the tax collections that the district can look to for next year, but also on state funding. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. So it's important that we throw in some caveats that everyone understands at this point in time. We are presenting a budget to the board this evening for adoption because it's a legal requirement to do so. But everyone needs to understand that there will have to be budget amendments forthcoming over the course of the summer as we get clarification on House Bill 3 and how that needs to be interpreted and implemented at any given school district, certainly Seguin ISD included. So what's not going to be included in tonight's budget that is presented for board approval? Primarily these things here. Staff salary increases for the next school year will not be included in this budget that is presented this evening, as well as additional funding requests that have come from campuses and departments. The reason these items are on hold is because there are specific requirements from the state as to what will have to be earmarked and paid out in terms of employee increases. And in order to make sure that we are able to comply with those guidelines, we can't go in and approve the requests that have come in that are not what we would call non-negotiable requests. Now, there are some non-negotiables, and those items have been presented in the budget that's provided tonight. And they're non-negotiable because they're either items that have been committed from a prior year. A good example of that might be a software that was started in the prior year, and maybe it was subsequent to the original adoption, budget adoption from the prior year. But in the current year, that software was approved, purchased, and now we have an ongoing cost. We have to include that new cost in the current year budget, or in this case, in the 2019-2020 budget. Another example would be fees that we have no control over. The appraisal district assesses a fee based on property values. If that fee goes up to an extent that we need to do a budget amendment for the following year, we have no choice in that matter. Utilities, things of that nature, are non-negotiable. So those are built in, but these two items are not. The items will be addressed before the start of next school year, before the contract start date for our teachers. However, we are needing additional time because we need clarification from the Texas Education Agency on how to interpret and how to apply the House Bill 3 requirements. And so there is some information that is coming out from TEA as we speak. Every day a little bit more comes out, but there is still a lot of clarity that's necessary to truly implement. And that's why you see a few districts are starting to say how much their increases will be, but with respect to the number of districts that are out there, It's a very few that are actually going out on a limb and saying this is what their increase will be. And a lot of those are quite conservative as you look through those. So let's talk about the revenue side of the general operating fund budget for next year. One of the things that I want to share with you is how we're comparing next year's budget with the 2018-2019 budget. And it's important to understand at what point in time are we making this comparison. So the original budget for 2018-2019 you see there on the far left. And that budget was, for the revenue, $60,890,000. But during the course of 2018-2019, information came through, changes were made. For example, property taxes. We just mentioned that we don't know when we adopt the original budget, we don't know what the final property values are going to certify at. So you can see that first line, property taxes, that line item was adjusted up once we had clarification and a better understanding. The next line, local sources, the bulk of that is interest earnings. Interest rates, as you may know, have been on the rise over the course of the last year. And as a result, we moved from $911,000 original budget up to $996,000. And this is as of the financials that were presented to you for the month of April. So these numbers are as of what you received last board meeting. State sources, they went down slightly, and that's attributed to the reduction in student enrollment. We had less enrollment, and ADA is the primary factor that drives state funding. It continues to be so to this day, but imagine right now we are adopting a budget and looking at state sources for next year, and yet we haven't started school yet, so we have no idea what our enrollment is. We have an idea, but it's only an idea. We won't know definitively until school begins and registration has taken place. Federal sources remained the same throughout the course of the year. And so we moved from the original budget on the far left to the current budget as of April. And so I go to the next slide, and when we're looking at the proposed budget for next year, we're basing it off of the the budget that was presented to you as of the month of April, the most current information we had at the time this was generated. And so when you see the adjustments here on the revenue side for next year, they're associated with current budget for 18-19 to proposed budget for 19-20. Now that's easy to explain when we look at it from the revenue standpoint. But now let's take a look at expenditures. A little more detailed, but it's the same process. So as we're looking at the expenditure side of the general operating fund, you can see each of the functional areas that we operate. And I apologize again, if you have any questions, you might have to speak up a little bit. I may not see you. But we certainly can answer any questions along the way if you have some. So as you have the functional areas listed here by expenditure, again, as we mentioned on the revenue side, we're looking first on the far left, the original budget, and you can see, hopefully, that was $60,126,865 was the expenditure budget in its original form as adopted by the board last year. But then as we went through the year, you'll notice that the budget went up exceedingly on the expenditure side to the point that it reached $64,236,738. We'll highlight that because even anyone would certainly want to understand why did that happen. So we have a little note here. When we adopt the budget, there are certain things that are not included, as was mentioned earlier. One of the largest items, which is not mentioned in the note here, is we are adopting a budget prior to a wage increase. Once we know what we can afford in terms of a wage increase, last year that was about $1.8 million, was added into the expenditure side of the budget. So that's part of what took you from $60 million to $64 million. An additional component that led to the 64 million on the expenditure side is noted here, and those are things that are not associated with current year revenue. And those things would be the items that would be paid for out of fund balance. Each of those listed there were brought to the school board and approved by the school board throughout the course of the year. So you have the QZAP payment for the year. There were uniforms, defibrillators, it's not listed, but it's in there with uniforms. The time clock system, the pre-construction costs for the Matador Stadium, as well as the Sager preparation for fiscal year 1920 operations. All of those things totaled at about $2.4 million. And then the rest of that is associated with the wage increase that was brought in subsequent to the original adoption. So the question then, if you're looking at the revenue as compared to the expenditures, we're expending more than we're bringing in. But every bit of the amount that we're bringing in above that revenue amount of 61 million is associated with fund balance items. So it's a balanced budget aside from what was purposely approved to come out of fund balance for the items as you see there. And you can refer each of these numbers back to the financial statements that were presented to the school board last month. And you can see a note disclosure at the bottom of that financial statement that really details this out a little bit more.
I have one question.
Yes.
I know the QZAP's different because the money comes off the M&O side. It's different from the bond payment. Why don't we put that in the budget? Why does it come out of fund balance? Good
question. So the original board resolution was to move $20 million from general operating fund over to, well, no, I take that back. I'm confusing the two. I apologize. They actually are tied together. The original board agenda to take $20 million and move it into the capital improvement fund was going to be a fund balance item, that $20 million. When QZAP came in for $10 million, almost $8 million of that was used to go into the capital improvement fund and reimburse the general operating fund for that original $20 million that was approved by the school board to come out of fund balance out of the general operating fund. So because it was a fund balance assignment originally, to pay it back, instead of one-time payment of $20 million out of fund balance over to the capital improvement fund, now it is it's the same payment, but it's going to be spread out over the course of 15 years. But it's always coming out of the general operating fund balance, just as was the original resolution.
And that resolution was made prior to the start of the construction of high school, the new high school?
No, that was made subsequent to construction of the high school. I don't have the exact date of it. I believe, but we can look it up. It's online. I want to say it was in October of 2016. I believe that's when it was, but I'd have to confirm that.
And then what was that 20 million going to be used for?
So the original budget for the construction of the high school was $85 million, but that was only enough for construction itself. It was not enough for FF&E or any contingencies associated with the project. So at that time, the board decided that an additional $20 million would be necessary in addition to just the construction cost to cover the entire project. And so that $20 million, now there would have been at that point in time an option. The board could have value engineered the project down an additional $20 million, but instead the decision was to move $20 million, leave the project as designed, and move the $20 million out of fund balance from the general operating fund.
How much was in fund balance at that point?
32 million, I believe. And the bulk of the 20 million that was transferred out has been returned either by way of QZAP, which will be spread out over 15 years, or by way of cost. As I mentioned, part of that 20 million was a contingency. The original contingency in the capital improvement fund project was only 3%, but industry standard is closer to 5, sometimes 6%. So we pushed that up because it was the infancy of the project. We pushed that contingency up with the hope, and it did come to fruition, that the bulk of that contingency came back. So I'd have to look at and actually I have it here. I can look at, well, no, it might be very end here. You're not going to be able to see this very well. Let me take a look. So, I can't read that very well. Apologize, it's just too small. I believe that is showing anticipated, I believe that's 23 million. It is very difficult to see on this. You don't have the print out with me. But so we're anticipating fund balance in the general operating fund at the end of this year to be, it's either 22 or 23 million. I apologize, but I just can't read it. But all but 7 million of the original 20 million has been returned to the general operating fund of that original transfer out. And what we can do is have a separate presentation that details that whole transaction. We've done that a couple of times. It's been a while though, and we can certainly go over that to give you the details and sum up the project. The construction project for that program has been completely closed out. So we're in a position, it's reconciled. We can give you the details of where we stand, what was not reimbursed back to the general operating fund.
So that QZAP that's standing alone over here will eventually be closed down?
Correct. Yeah. The program, so it's a bond issue, so you have to pay that back over the course of 15 years, but you have to spend the money in 3 years. And by the end of this summer, we will have spent all of the QZAP dollars. We have actually until October 2019 to spend them. But we used everything we could associated with the bond fund, but you can't use QZAP dollars to build anything that has a new footprint. And so you're very restricted with what qualifies. But you can spend it on equipment, any kind of FF&E, so that's where we spent the dollar, or replacement things. So when you do demolition, a lot of things are being replaced, so we were able to qualify QZAP dollars for some things, but not for others. Do we sufficiently cover that for everyone? Okay. Let's see, hopefully, okay. So when we look forward to the expenditure side of the general operating fund now, again, we're comparing the current budget as of April 30th to what we're proposing for next year. And keep in mind that we understand that that is going to have to be amended and come up primarily for increase in employee wages, but also for those other additional requests that have come from campuses and departments to the extent there are sufficient funds coming to cover those items. But we have to cover what's required by the state first for employee increases.
Is there a breakdown of what the different numbers mean within those?
Yes, I can, if you want, I can kind of go over what those different ones are.
Is it available to the public?
There is, on TEA's website, you can, it's, as with everything with TEA, it's quite convoluted and involved. They don't give you a nice summary that says this is what function 11 instruction is. They give you a matrix.
I'm talking about our budget.
She's talking about our budget, not the function numbers.
Okay. Yeah,
But
we can.
for instance, instruction, what does that mean? What's under instruction?
The things that are going to be associated with Function 11 instruction are going to be specific to the actual classroom. And the 90% of that is teacher salaries.
So if someone comes to me and they have a question, I'll use actual scenarios
Okay.
that I've witnessed or I've been asked. Let's say I hear we need new band instruments. How would I know if that's funded in this budget? Or let's say the ag department needs a new vehicle. How would I know if that's being funded?
Well, you're not going to know it from a summary level like this.
Exactly. How would I know that? How would I get that information?
Well, you could ask me, or depending on the program, you can ask them, because each individual that is responsible for their area of the budget is aware of what they've requested and what they are funding with their budget.
And how does the
So-
general public get that information? So if I'm asked, I don't like to say I don't
Sure.
know.
Well, it's a challenge because we have nearly 12,000 lines in our chart of accounts, so it would be virtually impossible to, on the front end, answer everyone's question about everything that's...
Well, let me chime in. I think it's important if someone from the public is curious about, let's say, funding for band instruments, that they reach out to someone from administration to be able to get a good understanding of where we are with that. I think when it comes to certain resources like band instruments or Chromebooks, whatever it may be, I think it's important that they get the information from the appropriate administrator, if that makes sense.
It really just has to do with the level of detail that's there. There's just so much. There's not a practical way to provide that information. Not that we don't want to, but we would have to do it as a response to a request, as opposed to just saying this is every little detail.
This is my first time through the budget process, and I don't feel like I'm asking anything that one of my constituents wouldn't ask.
Sure.
So I just need to know how to respond, so I appreciate that response.
Okay.
Doesn't it also tie back that we're not including in our budget the additional funding requests from the campuses and departments because we don't know how they're going to translate?
Well, that's part of it, sure. That's going to be associated with additional requests.
Right.
But they are receiving the same allocation up front that they received in the prior year. So we have an obligation to maintain the level of effort on a per pupil basis for every campus and every grade level, even at that. So they still get that. And that also speaks a little bit to your question, Ms. Duncan, because part of the issue is at the campus level, they do have a level of autonomy. They get their allocation, and then they can choose how they move that money around. And there are some restrictions, there are some guidelines, but by and large, if there are band instruments, for example, that are needed at a given campus, and the principal decides, you know what, I'm going to move some money into that line item of my budget this year. It's a one-time thing, I'm going to take care of it. They have the ability to do that. They don't have to do it that way, because that's maybe an example of something that could be quite expensive, and it would need to come by way of what Ms. Moreno is referring to, a special request, so that we could fund it most likely out of a fund balance item. But many other items would be something you just, one year you're going to focus in this area, another something else. And it's not going to be the same at every campus, nor will it be the same in every department. And so that level of autonomy is there for that reason.
Thank you.
Does that help? Okay.
It may be helpful if on our website, now if you go to our website, you will pull up budget, it just has a one-page summary.
Mhm.
So it may be helpful to the general public if we could give a short description of each of these expenditures. In other words, what is instruction? What are we spending money on? You're saying most of it's teacher salary.
Sure.
What is most of the money being spent on for social work services or health services? Just a short one or
Little
two
blurb.
paragraph description.
Okay.
Just so they can know where the things that they're interested in at least fall on the budget. Maybe that will help them figure out who to talk to.
Sure. We can certainly do that.
Will that help?
Yes, that's helpful.
We'll make an attempt at it, and we'll look forward to your feedback.
Just don't want any surprises.
Right.
to pop up.
We certainly appreciate that. We don't want surprises in the business department either. So if we can help with some clarification on what these titles mean, we'll certainly make our best effort at that. So if we're looking at the current budget, and then you're looking at the proposed budget, you're noticing a lot of reductions to the tune of $2 million. And again, that speaks to the fact that in that current budget, a lot of those, or actually every one of those items are associated with fund balance assignments that were approved for 18-19. We do not want to commingle those into or bring those forward into the 19-20 budget. If we have one-time items or specific items that we would like the board to consider as a fund balance item, we'll bring those throughout the course of the 19-20 school year. Right? So in summary, even to a greater degree than what we saw a moment ago, we see the revenue versus the expense, and you can see on the proposed budget, it is a balanced budget. And once we have more clarification from TEA as to what we can expect to bring in additional dollars from the state, then we will increase both the revenue and the expenditure side of the budget to accommodate for not only the raise requirement, but hopefully all or most of the additional requests that have come in throughout the course of this last year for next year. So just a reminder of why we appear on the surface to look upside down in terms of expense versus revenue on the current budget for 18-19. That disclosure is there once again. So let's move now to the Child Nutrition Fund. We've got a current year update, just real quick, we'd like to share with you the program, and I was hoping to get a final count today. Haven't heard back from our director, but as of right at the end of the school year, we were on track to serve 1.6 million meals and meal equivalents throughout the course of the 18-19 school year. That's a 200,000 meal increase compared to the 17-18 school year. So it's a nice increase, and we're actually optimistic that we can expect similar growth next year. So we've kind of trimmed this budget down. It's much simpler than the general operating fund budget. There are 3 revenue sources, the bulk of which is clearly coming from the federal government. Those federal sources there is an anticipated increase, both because of a projected increase in meal service participation, but also an anticipated increase in the reimbursement rate that would come from the federal government for next year. It is likely that we will do a budget amendment for this because we do not have the formal reimbursement rate as of the time of creating this presentation. So there's a good possibility that there'll be a budget amendment forthcoming in the coming months for the food service program. We are purposefully, although the proposed budget for the child nutrition program is showing a balanced budget, 4.4 million in revenue and 4.4 million in expenditures. That is really, they're not going to spend 4.4 million in expense. We know that right now, but there's a requirement to have a balanced budget. We have to explain to TDA, not TEA, Texas Department of Agriculture, any additional revenue that comes in above and beyond expenditure. We have to have a plan of action to spend that money within the program. It can't come over to the general operating fund. The intent right now is to build fund balance so that we can use those fund balance dollars in the child nutrition fund to pay for the replacement of equipment at the A.J. Briesemeister construction that takes place, so that we will not have to use bond dollars. And we did something similar to that at the high school, the food service program. There was $800,000 that were originally budgeted for food service equipment that would have come out of the bond, but the child nutrition program was able to fund $560,000 of that. So we're hopeful that with a little bit of advanced planning, we'll be able to do something similar, possibly even fund 100% of the new equipment that would be installed in the HAV project. The debt service fund, oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Where would we see what's in the child nutrition fund now, whatever they're funded?
So it depends on what it is you want to see. If you want to see the financials, we provide those on a monthly basis. And you can see where the program is and where it's expected to go at any given point in time.
I just didn't know if it was included in the bigger number for fund balance, or
It's its own fund, as separate. And what we can do is, a lot of times I'll do this once or twice throughout the course of the year. You know, we do the financial statements as a consent item each month, and that's understandable. But a couple of times throughout the year, it's a good idea to take those out of consent and go ahead and have a discussion so that everyone really understands and feels good about what, and this is a good example. We're always focusing on the general operating fund, but we also are sharing the food service fund as well as the debt service fund each month. And so we can pull those out from consent once in a while and just have an additional board action, board discussion.
I just
But,
didn't know if
yeah.
they were up there somewhere.
They're not up here, and the last one that I would have would be the one from last month. Mhm. Okay, so the debt service fund, again, we have the same challenges with the debt service fund, or somewhat the same as we do with the general operating fund, and that is the debt service fund, the fund that is used to pay for your annual debt service on all of your, in essence, your mortgages on all of your buildings. That fund has absolutely no state funding, or very little. It's in 1819, it was about $250,000 is all we got. But the annual amount required for debt service is, as you'll notice in the next few slides, over 12 million. So all of that money is coming from the local tax effort. And as was mentioned earlier, we don't know what our certified values are going to be until the very end of July. An additional wrinkle for the current year is that we know, and that'll be brought up in our board meeting here in a little while, that next year we will issue new bonds and there will be associated debt with those new bonds, a new debt payment. And so we have to structure a budget right now, not even having sold the bonds, but knowing that we will owe on them at some point during the year next year. So we have to do some projections. And we have the tools to do that. We also have resources, one of which is here with us tonight, our financial advisor, Mr. Victor Quiroga. And he will speak to some of this in a little bit. But for this discussion, one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that we do have preliminary property values. We also have historical data. The Seguin community is fairly stable in terms of its growth, so that makes projections a little bit easier in terms of property values. The good news is we have seen increased growth in recent years, and we expect to continue to do so, to continue to see that growth. We also have to factor in the information that was provided to the community during the course of presenting the bond information, and that was that the district would limit the tax increase on the debt service side to 2.5 or to 5 cents for the overall bond proposition, which is 64 million. But it was noted that that would be spread out over the course of 2 years, so that at the end of the 2 years, the maximum amount that the district would increase INS tax would be 5 cents. So half of that is about what we expect to need for the current year, and then the other half for the following year. So 2.5 cents for the 1920 school year. And then we're also looking at the current bond market data and payment projections for what we anticipate the structure of the associated bonds to look like once we sell them in the next month. I think it's August 14th is the anticipated closing. So more on that in just a few moments. But those are some things that we consider as we developed this budget. So you'll notice the current budget, once again, in this case, I didn't bother to include a line that compares the original budget to the current budget. We can certainly do that if anyone would like to see that information. But we're taking the current budget as it stood for the month of April, and we're showing you with the things that I just mentioned, the increase in the tax rate. However, the tax rate will be compressed for next year, but we have taken that into consideration when looking at the property tax collections for next year. We've also taken into consideration the additional debt based on anticipated interest rates and term of the bond that we're looking to sell in the coming weeks. So that would be the debt service fund for next year. So I understand this is very difficult to see, and I apologize. There's just no way to present it on the screen. But this is the formal presentation that you will see as an exhibit to the action item that will be presented to the board during the course of the regular board meeting this evening. So it's the same numbers that we just discussed, but it's put in the format of the exhibit that you will see. I wanted that to be the last slide, or really in this case, the second to the last slide that we have for this presentation. I apologize for going a little bit long, but I'm available to answer any questions if you should have any.
Anybody have any questions out there? I just have one question. I feel like I asked it last year.
Okay.
Why do we have to do this in June when there's so many unknowns?
It's the state
Why are
requirement.
we a June district?
Well, that decision was made quite a few years ago, and there are pros and cons to whether you're a June 30 district or not, but it can be changed.
What, could it be changed to August or July?
Well, yes, August. August
Okay.
31st.
So that's what some other districts follow?
Some, mhm.
Some.
And that's what Seguin ISD was until, I want to say around 2006.
It just seems like it would make the budget process so much easier because we wouldn't have all these unknowns.
It does help in that regard. It hurts in others.
How does it
You're
hurt?
you're starting a new school year at the same time.
Oh.
We're doing a lot of things that are closing out the old year. So I wouldn't necessarily say one is definitively better than the other, but both of them definitely have their pros and cons.
Any other questions? If not, do you have a question? Yes.
Yes, I do. Okay. Sorry, I didn't make enough copies of these. Okay, perfect. And y'all can share that there and get this together. All right. Thank you. So first, I just want to make a general comment. Ms. Duncan, thank you so much for your questions about transparency. You having worked for the city of Seguin, you understand the size of the budget. I looked it up right now, and the city of Seguin's budget is 316 pages long. The Guadalupe County budget is 195 pages long, and itemizes it department by department to show exactly what it is that's being funded. So I like where you're headed. I think it's in the right direction, and hopefully the district can head more in that direction. So although I appreciate the check register being posted online, that's really helpful. So my question, based on the email that I provided you all, and looking forward, and it looks like there's going to be some budget amendments that are going to be made, my concern earlier this year, and I apologize that I've been away and just getting back, has to do with food services. And a question that I had asked back earlier this year had to do with the meals that are being purchased by teachers at the elementary schools. And if you look at the email, my question was, what is the meal portion that's being given to teachers at the elementary school? And the answer is they're getting the same meal size or portion that an elementary student is getting. Whereas if you're a teacher at a middle school, you're getting what a middle school student is eating. And if you're a teacher at a high school, you're getting what the high school teacher is getting. And to me, it just seems like a teacher is an adult, and they should be getting the amount of food that a teacher at the high school is getting. So as the budget is being debated, if it's something that's a cost, and I don't know if that's, if what the answer is to the question of what is it going to cost the school district? Is that something that the school district has to pay for, or is that something that the teachers are going to have to pay out of their pocket to be able to get the meal? Because it looks like they're paying the same across the board. The other question, again with food services, has to do with the staffing for the cafeterias at the elementary schools, and the number is provided in the back for you guys, and you can see how many employees we have at every elementary school and the number of meals that are being served per day at each one of those schools. And clearly there's a difference, significant differences between some of the campuses, and I'm just curious if there's going to be any consideration to increase the number of cafeteria employees to be able to help them deliver the meals to our kids. Because if you haven't been to one of the cafeterias, I mean, they have significant work that they have to do every day to be able to prepare the breakfast, to prepare the lunch, to make sure that all of that is being done, and it doesn't look like we're increasing the amount of support that we're going to be providing to them. So those are my points on this budget at this time.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? If not, we'll call this public meeting to an end at 6:46, and there's Nancy. And do any of you board trustees, anybody need a break before we get started on the meeting?